Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel, and in today's video we will do a deep dive into GraphQL. We will also understand the need of it, the fundamental aspects of it. We will also try implementing a GraphQL with Spring Boot. Right, so let's quickly begin with it. I've started my newsletter on Substack. You can go to suchet.substack.com where you will find all the newsletters and the articles I have been writing on the technology, and then you can subscribe to me. By doing so, you will get all the updates whatever I'm currently writing. And then as part of the YouTube video, I've documented everything on my Substack. For example, as part of this GraphQL video, I have documented everything on GraphQL newsletter, and whatever I'm basically discussing it with you as part of this video, you can go to my Substack and read over to this particular article newsletter. Okay, so guys, let's quickly begin with the REST, right? So see, you already have a lot of benefits of REST, right? I have already documented it here. You see, REST is very easy to use. It's very easy to implement framework, right? And everybody understands. The beauty of REST is everybody understands. Almost today, most of the organization, kind of 70% of the organization have been adopted with REST, right? So it's easy to implement. It's stateless, so you don't have to manage states in REST. So REST is kind of stateless, and that's the reason you can scale it well, right? You don't end up making it very complex where you have to end up maintain a lot of states. And the third reason is wide adoption. As I said, that most of the organizations have adopted your REST, and then there is a lot of support available. Second thing is the API versioning. If I say, let's say you are building a platform, you have a lot of versions of API, but you keep on upgrading your the feature of APIs, then the API versioning is kind of easy to implement as part of REST. And second thing is maintenance cost is low, and the development cost is also low, because developer doesn't has to put in a lot of effort to maintain and implement and doing these things from the very beginning. So these are kind of the benefits of REST, but let's also discuss about all these benefits comes with at what cost of pain areas, right? So there are several pain areas, I will say. So before we start with the pain areas, you see, let's assume for a moment that you have this JSON object. Everybody knows about JSON object, right? So it's a key value object. It's kind of a order response object where you have these all key and value pairings in it, right? So first problem is the problem of overfetching. So what is overfetching? Let's understand. So today, in the world of distributed system, the world of microservices, let's say if your organization is using distributed systems, a microservice, let's say you have a service, and then that service is being consumed by a client. Whenever I say client, that means a kind of a consumer application. It could be written in Java, it could be written in React, it could be written in Angular, it could be a browser-based application, right? But the point is, that particular application must be calling your API somewhere from the front end, right? So let's say there is an Android app, there is an iOS app, and there is a browser application. Let's say you are operating in a media domain, and every media domain, for example, Netflix. You see, Netflix has Android app, it has an iOS app, it also has a browser application, it also has a TV application, right? So every consumer need to call your API, let's say user API, but for that matter, it's not necessary that whatever response attributes that your Android application is consuming, it's not necessary that all those attributes must be consumed by your TV application or your web application, right? So you see, there is a problem here, right? You see, there is a hidden problem here. Problem is the problem of overfetching, right? So let's say when you call an API as part of your REST, right, what happens is, as part of REST, you call that API, REST will give you everything. REST will give you everything. It's up to you. If you want to use it, you can use it. If you don't want to use it, you don't have to use it. But the problem with, let's say if your REST has 100 keys, right, then those 100 keys or the response of those 100 attributes needs to be serialized, travel through that particular network, and deserialized at the client side. This is all consuming the benefit and degrading the performance. I can perform it better if I only send the 3 attributes, whatever my client needs, right? There is no point of sending all 100 attributes even though my client is not consuming it. So that's the problem of overfetching, right? So this is the problem that your GraphQL solves. How it solves, that we will see later. Okay, now there is another problem of underfetching, right? So problem of overfetching and the underfetching. The problem of underfetching is, let's say what you do today is, let's say you take this example, right? The order example. And you have your client applications here. Now your client applications send, whenever I say send, that means an API. It calls an API to this particular service, and then it gets the order details, right? And then the particular order has some kind of invoice. So let's say there is one order that comes back and it has an invoice 1, 2, 3. Then this consumer also need to render the information of invoice. So it will go back and call the another service, or let's say any service which is related to your invoice, looking after your invoice, it will get that information. Now your invoice may contain your products that you will have to render again in your UI page. So that particular consumer, let's say, needs to go back to your application and then need to get a product details. Now you see, you can solve this problem. You can, right? What you could do is, rather than calling this consumer 3 different APIs, you can have an aggregator service, right? That consumer will keep on calling that aggregator service, and this aggregator service will go to the respective services, consolidate the results, and it back to you. But the point is, you will always have to end up calling an aggregator service. So you see, REST could not do this thing, right? Where you call in just one endpoint. Eventually what you have to do, you have to end up implementing an aggregator service, right? So that's the problem of underfetching. REST has to call, somebody has to do those multiple calls on your behalf. Even you are doing so, or on your behalf aggregator service. Point is, the problem of underfetching. You will have to keep calling those APIs, but there will be multiple network calls, right? So that's the problem of underfetching, right? And then you have a rigid structure. As I said, let's say you have implemented an API. So let's say you have implemented an API, right? And then that particular API has some 1, 2, 3 field. Okay, and now you want to go back, and your client says, okay, we also want you to send some field X. Then you need to go through the whole development cycle and the deployment cycle, right? Because you have to create the particular story, need to become in your agile scrum, and then the developer will pick up, estimate it, do it, implement it, deploy it. You see, all those release cycle, the development cycle is being involved here. So that's the rigid structure, because it's not like that if you say I want another attribute, you will say, okay, I want X. You will have to implement the logic for X, right? So that's the rigid structure, because you will go and make changes in your controller. All those things will happen, right? Second thing is limited query capabilities. So limited query capabilities, when I say that, let's say I want you, being a REST person, if I ask you to create an API which needs to support sorting and pagination, right? So you are trying to fetch the records from database, and then that database can have 10,000 records, but you won't do in a manner where you will just return 10,000 records, go back to your client. Your client will always end up having a read timeout, because that's not the correct way. What you do is you will send the data in batches. So those particular batches will be known as pages. So this pagination and the concept of sorting, you will have to implement it manually, right? So all these concepts you need to implement manually, right? It doesn't comes with inbuilt support of it, right? And the last point is your no standard API specification. Although you have open API kind of things, Swagger kind of things, but still it's good to have luxury, right? You cannot impose developers to implement it. It's up to the developers and the organization if they have that standard of implementing it. So again, that's not a standard. It's kind of a luxury, where you could have a specification document which you can share among the cross organization and say that this is the document, this is what we support currently, right? So again, that's not there is no standard specification way. So you see, all these problems that we discussed, right, there have to be a solution for it, and this is where the GraphQL comes in. And as part of GraphQL, you overcome, although there are certain issues with GraphQL as well, right? Because this formula of one solution fits for all, it doesn't work. So GraphQL also have some issues. What all issues are there? You can find it in the document, and we will discuss them in the end. But the point is, although GraphQL has some issues, but if that GraphQL usage of GraphQL aligns with your business requirement, you can always go ahead and implement it, right? And the idea behind making this video and all these videos that I'm creating, it's to understand, being a developer, to create that thought process. If the GraphQL is the correct, is it the correct place to use the GraphQL or not, right? And you can always put in front of your management, hey, saying that this is the solution that we could do, this is the trade-off that we could do, right? So, but that's okay. Let's quickly begin with the GraphQL. So fundamentals, let's quickly understand the fundamentals of it. So there is one schema, right? So you see schema. So as part of the schema, so this is very central concept, as I said already. So the schema means, you know, for example, you have database schema that has all the definitions. In the same way, as part of your schema, you define your queries, you define your mutations. Now the question is, what is queries and mutations? So let's understand. So look at this diagram. It's very beautiful diagram. For example, in your REST, you have a method find by ID. For example, you have a method find all, or let's say get all, get by ID, etc., etc., so on and so forth. The point is, if you see all these methods, these are kind of nothing but a kind of get operations, right? You are reading some data from your backend. So you see, this data is going to application server, and then, so in terms of GraphQL, you simply call these methods of read operations. For example, your query of let's say query. So you're querying a data. If you say find by ID in REST, you'll say query, because it's a query because you're trying to read some data from your backend. Then you have some methods. For example, let's say add student, add employee, remove employee, remove employees. You see all these methods, you see these are eventually doing some kind of write operation, either deleting it, updating it, or writing it, adding anything new, right? But the point is, these are all create operations. These are the operation or write operations. There is something writing, so you call these operations mutations, because these are the mutations. For example, it's mutating something. There is a change happens, right? Change will happen in the background, in the backend, sorry. Now, so this is why then there are certain types. There are certain inbuilt types. Scalar types, that means your GraphQL comes with inbuilt types. Those are your scalar types. Boolean, ID, int, etc., etc. And then you have fields. Then those parts, that what we will see, what is field and how can we define an object field. So you see, for example, I want to define a query this. I want to define a method which will take an ID and return a user response, right? So it's a query. We will see all those things as part of Spring Boot implementation. For example, you have mutation. You have create mutation, taking name, email, and returning your user object, right? And the same way query. You're doing a query where you want ID, name, and email, right? So it will go to backend and get all the details. For example, you don't want email, you can remove the email. You will only get ID and name. Right, so this is query and mutation. As I said, as part of mutation, you do a write operation. So, for example, here as part of create, you are sending your name and email, and then in the response back, it's returning you ID, name, and email. All right, so that's mutation and queries. We already have gone through it. So let's quickly begin with the implementation. All right, guys. So you see, this is just a Spring Boot application, right? And then from this Spring, I'll give a basic brief of all the components of it, and then I'll go without camera mode, right? So you see, you have book object, right? And even before you have a look at the build.gradle, I'm using Gradle. I'm a Gradle person, so I prefer Gradle over Maven. You could use Maven, but the point is you will have to use these libraries, right? So what you could do, you could always go to start.spring.io and just search for GraphQL, right? If you go to explore, you will get the GraphQL here, right? So I've done nothing. I've already created an object unnecessary. I don't want it to waste all the time. And then that's it. And by default, when you add GraphQL, it comes with the support of Spring Web Flux. Okay. And then we have a book object, this object, and then we have a controller object, a control class basically that we will implement where all the query and mutation. This is our input DTO, where we will, because as part of creating a mutation, we will take an input of a book input and then we will add it to the database. And then there is a book service. So this is a basic service which does nothing but it maintains a list. So you can assume this list as your database. So I didn't want it to fall into unnecessary creation, database creation, all those things, right? So it's a list, it's acting as your database, and then you have get by ID, get books, and add book. So these are traditional methods where you pass in an ID, it will iterate through the list and get you an ID. And the same thing happens here. You pass the list of IDs, it will get you a list of book object. And same thing here, if you want to add something to your book, you simply call this method add book. Okay. So this is our basic a book service class, right? And then in the application.yml, we will have to create certain so for example, I think I didn't cover this part. So as part of this GraphQL starter, right, you also get a GraphQL, which is nothing but your client application in order to perform operations on GraphQL, right? So in order to enable your GraphQL in your application, you will have to add a property. I'll say GraphQL, we will have to say enabled is equal to true. Okay. And then you have this folder GraphQL that comes automatically right at the moment you add your GraphQL starter. So you will have to create a schema in it. So how can you do that? We will have to create a file, schema.graphql, right? So everything that is a part of GraphQL, either it could be a type, or it could be a query, or it could be a mutation, everything comes under part of your GraphQLs. Okay. Now let's say for our book service, I have this method, right, get by ID. Now I want to expose this as a query, right? So if anybody calls my /GraphQL and call this query, then he or she able to pass an ID, and I will get him a record of book. Okay, how can I do that? So in order to do that, I will have to go first and call this book service, let's say. Okay, now I will have to simply create a method. I need to return a book, so I'll say book by ID. Okay, now this ID will be a string, because if you see in my book we have IDs, right, as a string. So I'll say that I need a string, and then as part of this I'll say book service dot get ID, I'll say ID. Okay, now as part of GraphQL I have to use this annotation, query mapping, right? You see, query mapping, right? And you will have mutation as well. You see, you have mutable mapping as well, right? But here we are creating a query, so I'll say query mapping. So when I'll use query mapping, so what this Spring Boot will do is it will sense that this method will be acting as a query entry point for a query for me, right? And it will take, I want to tell GraphQL that you need to take an argument which is ID. Now it is just a plain string ID, but I want to tell GraphQL that it will be an argument for you. So the way of you define this is argument. Okay, so I have this get ID ID, but still it's not a get by ID, and then I'm passing ID in it, and it's acting as a query mapping. But point is, I have not created any query for it. See, because although I'm saying that this method will be acting as a entry point for my query, but where is my query? I have still not defined my query. My schema.graphql that I said in the newsletter, where I said that the schema will have query type and the mutation, etc., all these types. But you see, I haven't defined any query yet, so I will have to define a query first, right? So how can I do that? It's very simple. All you need is to type here query, right? And then I'll say book by ID. Now you need to use the same name that you used there, right? And then if you see, this method is taking up a type of ID. So in GraphQL, if you go back and you see that your GraphQL scalar type also has ID, right? So basically for ID type, the unique ID type, we will have to use ID. It's good practice. So what I'll do is I'll go back here and I'll say that I will be consuming an ID, and which will be of type ID. In return, I will return you a book. Okay. Now you see, it basically says that there is no book exists, right? There is no type of book exists because I have not defined it, right? For this query, for this GraphQL, you need to define everything in the schema, right? Although you have it here, but that's in your Java. But for GraphQL, you need to tell GraphQL that this is your query, right? And then this is your type. So I will have to define a type here. So to define a basic type, you will have to write like book, right? Now, what all do you have here? You have author, page count, author ID, so and so. All right, so I'll go here and then I'll go here. I'll say I'll remove all these things. Okay, now to ID, I already told you for ID that you will have a scalar type ID, and then name is kind of a string, so you will have to use the string, right? And the page count will be an int, you will have to use int, then the author ID will be string, you will have to use a string. So you see that if the error that was popping up earlier, that has gone away, right? You see, I already have a query book by ID, that matches with my controller query mapping book by ID. I also have this book. I have defined this book that I have it right here, and I say that this will return this book, correct? So now what I'll do, I'll simply, so everything is ready. So when I will run this and do a query from client, it will go here and search something, right? All right, guys. So now let's quickly start this application. Alright, so this application has been started. You see, it said loaded one resource in GraphQL schema, right? And it also said that the GraphQL endpoint HTTP post, you can access it from here. Okay, so now what I'll do, I'll go to my localhost 8080 and I'll go to GraphQL. Alright, so this is your UI for GraphQL. Now from here I can do multiple client queries. How can I do that? If I go here, you see, so remember the point in the newsletter I said there is no standard API specification present in REST, right? Although you have Swagger, but those are not standard things. So here you see client already coming up with the correct all the query definition, right? So what I want to perform a query for book where I will pass a book ID. Let's say, what is my book ID? I want to pass a book ID, let's say book 2, right? So how can I do that? I'll go here and I'll say for calling book ID, you need to call this book ID, and I'll say call book 2, right? And then what I want in return, I want author, I only want ID, right? So what I'll say, query. See, it basically got you the ID and only ID. That's the beauty of GraphQL. You see, if I say I also need name, so I'll go here and it will bring me the name. If you say I want the page count as well, it will give you the page count. I want to author ID as well, I'll say page ID. Now there is one consumer says that I don't want page count. I don't really need it. I don't need the page count. I don't need the author ID. I only need the ID and name. So you will simply query ID and name, right? So that's the beauty of GraphQL. So the problem of overfetching goes away, right? So now let's go back and say, now add a method where I want to call the list of IDs and it will get me the record of list of IDs. Let's see. Right, so how can you do that? So there is a method getBooks already present in your graph in your book service, right? So we can use this method. How can we use this method? So how can we use this method of getBooks? I'll simply go to my controller, all right, and then I can create a method for, let's say, find books, or let's say get books or something. So what I'll do, I'll create a method public, and then this will record a list of book, right? List of book, right? So I'll say find books, and this will consume a list of IDs. Okay, and then I will resolve this. Okay, and then I will have to call this method. So I'll say return book service dot get books, and I'll simply pass the IDs, right? But again, I will have to tell GraphQL that there is an argument, and what is the argument? Argument is the list of string, right? So I will have to pass this as argument, and then I will say this is also query mapping, right? Because I will have to map it with a particular query. Although I have not created a query, I will have to create a query, but that's okay. So now what I'll do, I'll go here, and then in the schema.graphql, here I will have to basically, now for example like this, I will have to create another query. This is a query, right? So what I can do, I can create another entry for this query here. Now again, same terminology, I will have to match the same name, which is find books. I'll say, go here, I'll say find books. Now we have interesting thing. We have IDs. What is the name of my argument? IDs. So I'll say IDs. Now what is the type of IDs? You see, what is the type of ID? I'll say IDs is, although it's ID, but it's a list. So how can I define that in GraphQL? I will have to use this array, right? So I'll say ID, right? And then I'll say, for example, now I want to say that this will return the list of book, correct? That's okay, right? So what you're saying is the find book methods accepts the list of IDs and returns a list of book, right? And then simple, right? And then in the GraphQL you already have this, right? Now go here and run this. Okay, now go back to our client, refresh it, go here. So you see you have find books as well, right? So you simply remove this, and then you click on find books and you pass the ID. I'll say ID. Now how can I pass the ID? I'll say, for example, if I pass book ID, book 1, and then what I need in return, I need ID and name. Okay, so it will give you the ID and name. Okay, now let's say I want to query for multiple books here, because you see IDs is a list of a string. So what you could do simply here is, it's in the same format, you will have to pass query, right? And then you could say bring me another book. So it will get you another book, you see, right? Now I'll say I want page count as well, and I want author ID as well. So I'll query and I'll get all these books. So you see, it's very easy for me. I don't want page count here. I'll go and say I don't want page count. That's it, simple, right? So now let's not make this video longer, and let's quickly create a mutation so you will understand that how the mutation will work, right? So what I'll do, I'll go here, and then in the controller I'll go and create a mutation, right? It's very simple again. So I'll go to my controller, and then here, let's say if you are creating a book, I'll say add book and book and here, right? But here the point is you will have to pass book input. Okay, and you, let's say you have your book input, okay, and then here you will have to return a book service dot add book and the book input. Now again, as it's not a query, right, you need to pass a mutation. I'll say mutation mapping, and again you will have to tell that this guy, there is an argument, you will have to pass this argument. Okay, now let's go back and create a mutation in the schema, because you will have to map this particular mapping with a schema, right? The mutation in the schema, right? So you will have to create that mutation. Now the first point is, in the mutation you see here it's using book input, but we have not defined anything in the schema input. So this GraphQL doesn't understand there is anything like book input. So what I'll do, I will have to create the same way a book input. I'll say book input, and then I'll define it as book input. So I have book and book input, I have both, right? So what I'll say, I can now define a mutation. I'll say define a mutation, right? Now in the mutation I will have to define this method. So I have book, which takes a book input, the name is book input, right? And then it's a type of book input. I already have the book input, and then it returns a book, right? It is a book input, right? It says the type of input is not an input type. Let's go back. Say book input. Alright guys, so this book input, it shows error. The type book input is not type. This is same, right? Book input. Book input is not input type. Oh, okay. We will have to use this as we will have to we will have to tell GraphQL that book input will be the input for this particular mutation, right? So it's all set now. Now if somebody calls this mutation, then this method will be called, because we have this mapping right here, and then it will add an entry into the table. Now I'll quickly run this. Alright, started. I'll refresh this. Go here, find books, select query, mutation. Okay. Alright, for some reasons I'm not receiving I can't see my mutation here, right? I can see the queries, but that's okay. What I'll do is I'll try to create. I have to create this. Okay, so I have my mutation now, right? So my mutation is, I'll have to, for example, I want to call this mutation. I'll say add book. Okay, now in the add book, I want to pass this book input. In the book input, I want to pass ID, name, and this author, right? And then when it will create this, let me make it a little more organized. Okay, so when I'll pass this, I'll say when you create it, it will return you a book, right? It will return you a book. So you see, if you look at the schema, it will return you a book. Now I need to tell that this guy, when you will return me this ID and name and page count. Okay, correct. Now how can I create this? I will have to create this, like I'll say ID 10. Okay, and then I'll say ID 10, and then to ID 10 I will say I'll move that here, and the name and the page count, the author ID. Okay, now the author ID. So let's say name, I'll say name 1, and author ID, I'll say author ID, I'll say 01. Okay, now see, I have passed ID as name. This is my object that I want to create and add into list and add into my database, right? And when it will done adding, I am asking this guy, you may return me ID, name of, page count of created book. So I'll say I'll execute. So you see, so it has executed this, right? Now what I want is, I want to do a query in order to understand that if I have the query or not, right? So I'll pass book. In the book, I'll say ID 10. All right. Now I'm asking this guy to return me all attributes. You see, ID 10 I have received. That means, so this query is returning from where? It's querying into the list, right? So I've just I did a mutation, so it appended one more entry ID 10. When I'm querying ID 10 with the ID, with the same ID, it's getting me a result now. So that means my mutation worked properly. All right. So by this application, I'll commit this application to my GitHub repository, right? And so it has these operations, which has, like, for example, mutation query. We also understand the type, scalar type, and all those things, right? The fundamentals of GraphQL and everything I have already added as part of this newsletter as well. You can go and check it around, right? Now, we are already reaching to the end. Let's quickly understand what are the challenges with the GraphQL. Although in the beginning of GraphQL, right, I said that although it's giving you it's overcoming all these the problems that REST has today, but it also comes with some challenges. So you see, the syntax of GraphQL, this kind of becomes very challenging, difficult when, let's say, you see this. you see all those things, right? Because I have to match this and this with the book controller and all those things. So it's not very easy to implement if you see overall, right? It's developer has to understand all the schema, because we have not talked about resolvers and we've not got into depth, right? So it's not easy to implement. Developer need a good understanding of GraphQL in order to understand this. Second thing is the complexity. So you must be wondering why this guy is saying complexity. So let's say here we are querying very basic objects of book, right, which has ID, author ID, name and page count. Let's say you have one object that also has another object that also has a class in it, that also has a list of other objects in it. So in my real-time organizations, you will have a lot of complicated objects, right? And building a query on that will be a little complicated. It won't be very straight away and easy. You will have to do a lot of nesting here. So those kind of queries become a little complex, right? That's what I've said, query complexity. And also there is some caching challenges, as I said, that because REST, it always returns the same data, right? Because you will always be returning ID, name, and then let's say address. But in GraphQL, somebody can request for ID, somebody can request for address, and the next time you don't, you basically nobody. Let's say you are not requesting for address. So because the data is varying, there are some caching challenges. Caching is not easy; it's a little bit tricky here. As I said, the overall, and you see, securing endpoint is also difficult, right? Debugging issue, as I said, right? It's all. So overall, you see, you only choose GraphQL if you are ready, right? If you are ready to basically, deal with all these challenges that I have mentioned here, because it comes with some of the issues, right? Even if you look at the debugging, right? Debugging is difficult, right? So we have reached to the end of this lecture, and we understood the REST versus GraphQL as part of this video, and then we also tried implementing it. We all understood the schema, and we understood that what is REST and the best for good part of REST. We also understood the challenges of GraphQL, right? So if you guys really think that that's something that adding to your knowledge, or if you want me to come up with more video, you can comment it down, right? And then I'll come up. And you can also go and subscribe to my Substack, which is suchet.substack.com. I'll put it in the YouTube description. All right, thank you so much, guys.